Well, welcome as we consider the final chapter in this study of the book of Daniel. Chapter 12 is the conclusion of a 3-chapter vision. In chapter 10, a vision was given to Daniel that concerned a great conflict. It was so sickening that he was out of action for 3 weeks, fasting and praying, until Michael came and he was able to be given further explanation, which we saw last week in chapter 11, as the kings of the north and the kings of the south charged backwards and forwards over top of God's people. Finally, at the end of chapter 11, there is a major conflict as the king of the south attacks the king of the north, and the king of the north in fury charges at the king of the south. He overflows the glorious land. Here are the people of God right in the middle of the conflict. But then, as the climax to chapter 11, he will pitch his palatial tents between the sea and the glorious holy mountain. And the chapter finishes, "Yet he shall come to his end, with none to help him." How that has echoes all the way back to the beginning of the book of Daniel. Back in chapter 2, how did it end? There was this great stone that came whoosh out of heaven and smashed everything, and it became the kingdom that was going to last forever. In chapter 7, at the end of the vision, the little horn power finds himself consumed and destroyed. In chapter 8, again the little horn power finds himself broken by no human hand. And so we go from that into chapter 12, and Annali, we're looking at chapter 12 today.
Yep.
And chapter 12 begins how?
With Michael standing up, basically.
Michael stands up. In fact, it says, at that time.
So it's all in one big chunk. No time has gone between the middle. This is like, when that happens, this then happens.
It's what does it look like when he shall come to his end and no one will help him? What does that look like? Well, there's our clue. At that time, Michael will stand up.
You very much got him sort of, there's the movement is happening. He's getting ready for action. That, when you're sitting, it's very passive. When he's standing up, it's I'm about to do something kind of feel.
In fact, we've already met Michael in this vision.
Right back at the start.
He showed up back in chapter 10. He came to relieve the angel who was really struggling with struggles that were happening backwards and forwards on earth. And Michael showed up, and we saw him came in a being with linen, with legs of bronze. When we looked at that, we recognised that this was the same description as the description of Christ in the book of Revelation. Michael's described as the great prince who has charge of your people.
I find that interesting because the phrase "your people" just sort of keeps coming up. That there's an association that these are your people, but it's the people you belong to. But that is not necessarily just there. In a verse or so, it comes. Everyone whose name is written in the book, those are your people.
And what is Daniel really concerned about?
His people.
His people and God's holy city, and here that's all coming together. The previous time we had the word prince was back in chapter 11, where the prince of the covenant, back in verse 22, that the prince of the covenant came under attack by the powers that were raging over the holy city. All right, so Michael, the great prince who has charge of your people, I think that's an expression for the people of God. And the next phrase is a bit scary. It says, there shall be
Time of trouble.
a time of trouble, but not just a time of trouble.
A real bad time of trouble.
A time of trouble that has never been since there was a nation till that time.
And considering, the history of the Jewish people, that, all the trouble they've been through, the exile, and they've had their fair share of strife. Just looking at, chapter 11, all of the strife that's been happening around them, and all of that is nothing on this. All right, so this time of trouble, there seems to be a little bit of a theme. Where else have we seen this time of trouble in Daniel?
It's interesting, in chapter 2, the wise men of Babylon had a time of trouble when Nebuchadnezzar said, kill a lot of them. In chapter 3, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego had a time of trouble. They were told, bow or burn, and they said, we'll burn. And they got chucked in the fire, time of trouble. I guess Nebuchadnezzar had his time of trouble too, didn't he? He chose to assert his independence and say, it's all about me. And God said, really? And so Nebuchadnezzar had his time of trouble. And Daniel had his time of trouble when he had a choice, pray or feed the lions. And he said, I'll feed the lions. And Belshazzer thought he'd have a party, but he ended up in a time of trouble. In chapter 7 again, we saw the little horn making war against the saints and defeating them right until the end. And again in that chapter, if I can find it, we had a power that will speak great words against the Most High, will wear out the saints of the Most High. Time of trouble. At the end of chapter 8, we have the same thing repeated again. He will destroy the mighty men and the people who are the saints. Without warning, he shall destroy many. So there'll be a time of trouble.
I think, though, with that, that there isn't that, that's only half of it you've got, but, at that time your people shall be delivered. And that is also a tradition, it's a tradition that's been part of the Hebrew story through all the centuries, and delivering from Egypt, deliverance, David in the Psalms talks about deliverance a lot. And you've got this, they're going hand in hand. You've got the time of trouble, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, and deliverance. You've got Daniel, in the lion's den, and you've got the deliverance. So you've sort of got them tag teaming each other through the book.
And you've got Belshazar's feast. And there was no deliverance.
Yes.
And really, these stories are coming to their climax as we come to chapter 12. There were time of trouble such as never been since there was a nation till that time. But, and I've got a big red circle around that but, at that time, same phrase that we began the verse 1 with, at that time, your people shall be delivered.
Also, I think it's interesting, there's no, we're removing you from the trouble. There's no sort of, we're keeping you away from it. It's just, when it gets there, know that you will be delivered.
So God didn't keep Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego out of the fiery furnace.
No.
But he was there in the fiery furnace with them.
And I think sometimes it's really easy to kind of have this, trusting God that he will get us out of it, but not trusting God enough to step into it.
And Daniel, after the lion's den, says, my God has sent his angel. Daniel spent a night with an angel. God didn't keep him out, but God was present there in a way that he wasn't in a regular.
And I wonder if that's one of the greater themes of the book of Daniel. You've got, this concept of God's sovereignty over all, but again, it's not keeping us away from the trouble. It's God's sovereignty and presence with us through the trouble and delivering us when the time is right.
So here at the end of the trouble, God's people are delivered. And then Daniel says, no, we need to say that a different way. Everyone whose name shall be found written in the book. And book just comes up
a few
times here. In fact, we came across book back in chapter 7 when the judgment was set and the books were opened.
You've got the books being opened in Revelation as well.
And in fact, we've got books being sealed and opened right here in chapter 12. We're coming to that. Everyone whose name shall be found written in the book. But yes, you're right. Revelation, the holy city, everyone whose name is written in the Lamb's book of life.
There's very much some overlaps between Daniel and Revelation, particularly here.
At this point, yes.
At this point.
And to add to that, in verse 2, and many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake. It's possible in the time of trouble down through the ages, some of God's people have gone to sleep. I guess it was Paul who said, we won't all sleep, but we'll all be changed. And here is Daniel beginning a concept that's going to be really picked up and developed in the New Testament.
But isn't mentioned that much in the Old Testament.
It's not.
Particularly, the next part of it, some to everlasting life. This is the first reference in the Old Testament to the concept of everlasting life, or that specific phrasing, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And again, this is the first reference in the Old Testament to, the resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked.
So there comes a time when all find themselves accountable before God.
And I find it interesting that, even back in Daniel's time, long before, it's dealt with a lot more in the New Testament, obviously, but even back in Daniel's time, there's these little seeds being sown of what's growing.
And it's going to come to fuller expansion a little bit further on. But here are two groups. And as we come into verse 3, we realise that the two groups are the wise and the wicked. Verse 3 introduces us to the wise. Well, it doesn't actually. It points to the wise, but we've already met the wise back in chapter 11. But here Daniel says, those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the stars above. And those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. We came across the wise first back around about verse 33 of chapter 11. 32 had many people being seduced with flattery and falling away. It had the people who know their God standing firm. Verse 33, and the wise among the people shall make many understand.
We've got that coming up later in this chapter as well.
We have got it coming up again in chapter 12.
It's just sort of a repeating idea.
But even though they understand, it says, though for some days they shall stumble by sword and flame, by captivity and plunder. It's almost like the Babylonian captivity experience, isn't it?
Even later on, it's, the Waldensian experience even.
And it's interesting, the Waldenses often describe their experience as the Babylonian captivity. Yeah, even though for some days it says they shall stumble by sword, captivity and plunder, and when they stumble, this whole idea of God's people stumbling, I find it a very encouraging one, because how often do we stumble?
And it's not even a question of if, it's when. It's not you have to be perfect, you're not allowed to stumble. You're going to stumble. So when that happens...
And there's a difference between stumbling and falling. Yeah, but verse 34, when they stumble, they shall receive a little help, and many shall join to them with flattery. There's that problem again. It's almost the wise and the foolish of Jesus' parable, isn't it? Verse 35, and some of the wise shall stumble. There's that idea again, repeated. But then it says, so that they may be refined and purified and made white until the time of the end. For it still awaits the time appointed.
And you've kind of got this gradual process of, using the journey, using the stumbling and the rising again and the stumbling to be refining and recreating people in the way God wants them to ultimately end up.
So as we come back into chapter 12 and verse 3, here are the wise who shine like the brightness of the sky, those who turn many to righteousness, like the stars forever. Here are some people who are shining in a time of trouble.
There's something really beautiful about this, and that, you've got this time of trouble, and everybody, your usual instinct to trouble is to kind of run and hide, and you've got these people who are out there shining and being beautiful and, I guess in a sense, still being a blessing to the world even through their time of trouble.
It talks about them being like the stars. When do the stars come out?
When it's darkest.
You go down to the city and you've got all the lights around you. How many stars do you see?
Maybe a couple, maybe.
And you come out to our place and there's no street lights. You go out at night and you look up and here are the stars. And the darker it is, the more stars that you see.
And I almost wonder if, you've got those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. You've almost got this sense of the more your eyes adjust to the darkness, the more stars appear. And I wonder if there's a sense of, that the turning people to righteousness, you've got all these little stars twinkling on.
And these must have been encouraging words for Daniel, who's been looking at this and saying, how's it all going to show up?
Yeah.
And here he's given a picture of people who are glowing, who are shining in the darkness. The right to the end, there'll be people who shine with the light of God right to the end.
And I think there's some encouragement in that for him as well, in that, he and particularly a couple of his friends, but have very much been, in the middle of exile in Babylon, shining, really. And it's that, this influence, this shining despite everything, this is going to go on. And this is a legacy that he's been part of and that will continue on past him.
But at this point in time, the message moves to a but.
A but.
But you, Daniel, it's time to shut up the words, seal the book. And when you think about it, he'd been there since he was probably about 18, and that was 70-something years ago. He's getting to be an elderly man. He's done his part. He's shone in the dark. It's now time to shut up the words, to seal the book, until
the time of the end, which must have seemed so bewildering and far off for him. There'll be aspects to it that he can relate to. He's in captivity, they're experiencing trouble. He can kind of understand that it will be a little bit like this, but the time of the end is a long way removed.
And it's an expression that he's been given a number of times. The vision of Daniel 8 was for the latter days. It was for the distant future. It was for the time of the end. And here that theme is being picked up. And we're going to see before we get to the end, till the end, till the end, till the end. But for you, Daniel, you've done your part. Well done. You can close
the book.
Close the book. The time will come when it will be opened. And then there's a little phrase, many will run to and fro and knowledge shall increase. And I remember growing up that, motor cars and jet planes, rockets, satellites, internet, Wikipedia, Google. I don't think it's talking about that. Looking at the context of it, the knowledge that's going to increase, and perhaps understanding's a theme we've talked about.
Well, it's a theme that, keeps coming up later on as well. But I almost wonder whether the to and fro is this sense of it takes us a while to figure it out, that, it's not just one clear path. There's a bit of zigzagging to come to understanding.
Maybe. At this point, Daniel digresses. Well, he looks elsewhere. He's been standing beside the Tigris during this vision. And he looks and he sees a couple of other people there. One on each bank of the river. And then here's our man in linen again. We met him back at the beginning of the chapter.
And it's a very similar description also to in Revelation, I think 1, around about verse 12. It's a very, very similar description to the...
which was very much a picture of Jesus. In chapter 10, this man, I believe, was the Michael who came in to give the angel messenger a hand.
I'm pretty sure he was by a stream then as well.
He was. That's where we picked up that it was the Tigris.
Well, at this point, he's now above the waters of the stream.
And there's that little bit of vagueness here as well.
You've got you've got Daniel, and he glances across, and there's two others, one on either side of the stream, and then the one in linen who was above the stream, and someone else. There is sort of no clarity there. There's just someone said to the man.
And it's an interesting question. How long? Or until when? It's the same question that was asked back in Daniel 8, when they had seen all the dreadful things that were happening to the truth and to the sanctuary and to the people of God.
We've even got the those questions in David and other places, how long?
It's a common question, how long? And it's one that we ask, we've got this COVID-19 virus going around that is the reason for us live streaming today. And some of us, after 3 days, are starting to say, how long? When's this
how long till we can get back out and go to work and go to concerts? And
when's this going to end?
And I think it's interesting. You've got, the end of these wonders. The idea of the wonders being, this big God-sized, I don't understand. How long till this big God not understandable thing is done?
And he does get an answer. The man clothed in linen puts up his right hand, puts up his left hand.
Which kind of sounds a bit like he's making an oath. And the two people on either side of the stream is a common biblical, you've got to have two people as a minimum witness for an oath to be made legally.
Yeah, and seeing as it says, and swore by him who lives forever and ever, it sounds like it is an oath.
This is an oath.
And that's interesting that you needed two witnesses.
And that Daniel notices these two people, and has he made that connection? We don't know, but that you've got these two extra people there who seem to purely be there just to witness.
Interesting. But the message is not that encouraging. It'll be for a time and times and half a time, and then when the shattering of the power of the holy people comes to an end, all these things would be finished.
Don't you love it when God answers the question with something that leaves you even more confused than you were before?
Or is not really encouraging.
Yeah.
When the shattering of the power of the holy people.
There's a lot in that.
We came across it back in chapter 7. As I looked, this horn made war with the saints and prevailed against them. It looks like it's winning, hands down.
Even in the beginning of this chapter, before the deliverance, there shall be a time of trouble such as never been seen. So all the trouble you've known, that's nothing on this.
And it almost looks like the people of God are going to lose when suddenly the tide turns and everything finishes. In verse 8 he says, I heard but I didn't understand.
I love Daniel here because we get this sense that, a lot of the biblical writers, they understood this, they knew what they're talking about, they were just expounding their wisdom for us to understand. But seeing Daniel here going, I saw all of it with my own eyes, I heard it, but I don't understand.
And it's interesting, chapter 9 had that problem too. 13 years after the vision of Daniel 8, here he is searching the books of Jeremiah, trying to
make sense of it.
Trying to make sense of it. Sometimes we have an idea that a prophet knows everything from the beginning, rather than they have to search, that sometimes they don't know what they're talking about, but they are saying what they have been told to say.
And they're doing the best they can with their human understanding, really.
And so he asks a question. Oh my Lord, what shall be the outcome of these things? Where's it all going to end?
I kind of feel like God's response is something a little bit like he gave Job. Like Job has got all these questions for God and God doesn't answer any of them. He just kind of, says, I'm God. Do you want, here are so many things you don't understand and you don't need to understand because I get them. But he doesn't ever actually answer Job's question.
And he doesn't answer Daniel's question. He says, go your way, Daniel. It's almost like, Daniel, go away.
And I wonder if there's almost a sense of, particularly hearing, time of trouble, the shattering of the power of the holy people, there's can I get some more details on that? He's kind of, you almost feel like there's an uncertainty there. He's like, what's going to happen?
And God says, Daniel, you don't need to suffer from time of trouble-itis. Go your way. The words are shut up and sealed until the time of the end. Here is enough for you. And here we have it in verse 10. Many shall purify themselves and make themselves white and be refined. It's the exact same phrase we had. The wise shall stumble so that they may be refined, purified, and made white. So here are people that are going to go through a challenging time. And this challenging time is going to make them a faithful and spectacular people of God.
And I think some of it is, this information isn't new. This is information we've been given before in the chapters, but it just sort of keeps coming up. And I think every time it comes up, you get a little bit more of a glimpse as to what he's saying and what the implications of it are. And as it goes on, we've got a really specific separation. You've got the actions of the many will purify themselves and be white and refined, make themselves white and refined, and the wicked shall act wickedly. You've got this distinction. But the distinction that follows that is none of the wicked shall understand and the wise shall understand. So we've got this understanding being that sort of dividing point, that it's based on whether you're understanding or not.
Okay. And one group has understanding and the other group has
no understanding.
No understanding. I found it interesting. It's not those who act wickedly will be wicked, but it's the wicked act wickedly. There's something in the heart.
And that it's an outpouring of the wickedness. It's not, people did some wicked things, so they must be wicked people. It's the people who are wicked will do what wicked people do.
And so there's this interesting play, and I think this whole section can be called The Wise and the Wicked.
which is kind of a theme that comes up fairly often in the Bible.
It is. And then there's some tricky stuff.
Which is a really weird spot to put the tricky stuff, like 2 verses before the end of the book. Either way.
From the time that the daily is taken away, and a lot of translations put in burnt offering, but as we've already discovered in Daniel, the expression daily refers to the whole ministry of the sanctuary, to the lamps that were burning continually, to the lamb that was continually on the altar, to the bread that was continually on the table, to the incense. All of these that point to the ministry of Jesus. Here is an attack on that which is central to the wise, Jesus. And here the picture is that this is taken away, and in its place is an alternate sacrifice.
The abomination that makes desolate, which is again a phrase that's popped up a few times.
Popped up. That we've got the true worship of Jesus, and we've got an alternate, almost a counterfeit sacrifice. It's quite broad, because here are the issues of the great controversy, which is what this chapter began with, a vision that concerned a great conflict. Here is the issue, the choice between Jesus and an alternate sacrifice. And he says, that'll be 1290 days. Wonder what that means. I have no idea. And there's no further explanation given it.
It's almost like a PS at the end.
And verse 12 begins with a beautiful word.
Blessed. And I think it's one of the few things that is very much more generalized. Like a lot of the advice that's been given so far is for Daniel specifically, whereas this feels a lot more generalized to, everybody else. Blessed is he who waits.
He who waits. It doesn't say blessed is he who has all the knowledge. Mm-hmm. It's not blessed is he who can give all the explanations.
Or even blessed is he who does all the right things.
But he who waits and who arrives.
At the 1335 days. Another number just thrown out there on the way.
but given without explanation.
Yeah.
And so in verse 13, that phrase, go your way, Daniel. Daniel, just drop it, leave it.
Which I think is really interesting, because he's just dropped in, the 1290 days, the 1335 days, but go your way.
Daniel, there are some things you don't need to understand. There are things, God's got his appointed times, and that come up over and over again. Don't spend so much time fretting about the appointed times as being faithful till the end. Yeah? Go your way till the end.
Live your life.
And for Daniel, he says, and you shall rest. It's not the same word as sleep at the beginning of the chapter, but it has the same meaning. Those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake. Go your way, you shall rest. And you shall stand in your allotted place at the end of days. What more does Daniel need to know than his life is in God's hands? That whatever the bumps along the way, whatever the time of trouble,
and all these confusing things that God's thrown in that he doesn't really understand what they mean, but ultimately this is what God needs Daniel to know.
That at the end of the days, he will stand in his place.
You've almost got early undertones of that, well done, my good and faithful servant here.
Mm-hmm. And of Paul, I have finished my race. I've run a good race, And now there awaits that crown of righteousness which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give to me, but not only to me, but to all of those who have loved his appearing. And so the book of Daniel finishes with this encouraging passage to Daniel. Daniel, it's not about what you know, it's about who you know. It's about whose you are. In this chapter, he's been called Daniel, the one who is greatly beloved. And our prayer is that as we conclude this study of the book of Daniel, that you too will hear God's voice say to you, O one who is greatly beloved, you are my beloved son, you are my beloved daughter. Stay with me and you will stand in your allotted place at the end of the days.